So real quick, I just wanted to let you know, typically when I'm doing a wheel bearing, I have to remove brakes. When I do that, of course I'm going to want to take apart the brakes so I can analyze everything thoroughly. Other people might just go ahead and take out the entire bracket with the caliper assembled and then just set it aside without even looking at the brake pads. It's completely up to you, but for me personally, it makes sense to just tear it apart. Okay friends, it's time to get started on our job. One of the first things you want to do is safely raise and support the rear of the vehicle so the wheel's off the ground. After that, let's go ahead and get these plastic covers off of here and use our 19mm to remove all 5 of our lug nuts located behind them. Remove your wheel. Now with the wheel out of the way, we have a nice clear view of the brakes. Now we're going to have to go ahead and start taking this apart. So what I want to do is go ahead and follow this e-brake cable to where it connects onto this control arm. We'll use a 13mm to remove that bolt. Alright, that's nice and loose. Now we're going to come right here. This is the area that holds the ABS wire to the e-brake cable. Just go ahead and pop that off of there so that has plenty of slack as well. Now let's move along to the back side of the caliper right here. We're going to go ahead and remove this caliper slider bolt using a 12mm. Go ahead and slide that bolt right out of there. Give it a quick inspection, set it aside. Now let's carefully get in between the bracket and the caliper itself, and we're going to gently pry to separate the two. This should just pivot upward. Once you have it pivoted upward, I'm just going to go ahead and wiggle it back and forth and gently pull it towards the center of the vehicle. As we're doing this, we're pulling that slider pin out of the top of the caliper bracket. There we are. You can slide this up here. Let's go ahead and get the pads out of here. Inspect your pads, set them aside. The next thing that we're going to do is go ahead and remove our 2 caliper bracket bolts. You're going to find one 15mm headed bolt right in this area here, and the other one's going to be located directly above it, easily accessed from up along the top of the rotor. Okay. Now that bolt's nice and loose. I'm just going to go ahead and put it in there just a couple threads. And now we'll fully remove the second bolt. There's one bolt. Let's go ahead and fully remove that other one now. Remove that caliper bracket. Set it aside. Remove your brake rotor. Let's go ahead and make our way along the back side of the wheel bearing. You're going to disconnect this electrical connector. To do that, just carefully pull on this tab and then slide the electrical connector out. Give it a quick inspection. If you see any funny colors, it's corrosion and it would need to be dealt with. That looks fine, so we can set it aside. Now is going to be time to start unbolting our wheel bearing. To do that, what you want to do is go ahead and line up the larger hole that you can see on the wheel bearing with the bolts that are located directly behind it. I'll just rotate this until it lines up with one of the bolts. Now we can use our 13mm socket. We'll come right in through this hole and start removing that bolt. There's one. Do the same to all. Now let's go ahead and use our hammer. We're going to give this a couple loving bonks to pull it off of here. Just keep in mind, it could potentially come shooting out at you, so make sure you just have a hand on it. I can see it starting to separate. It's a good idea to just make your way around. All right. Inspect your backing plate. Set it aside. Okay, now before we go ahead and put in our brand new wheel bearing, we want to pay attention to this entire area. The main areas that you want to pay attention to are along the inner portion where you can see all this corrosion. This is going to be super common because of course this area is aluminum and the wheel bearing is steel. So of course you want to just go ahead and scrape it out of there, all the large chunks, and then just hit it with a small wire brush and go ahead and clean it up so it looks nice and pretty. Aside from that, this entire flat area where the bearing needs to be, you want to make sure that that's clean and free of all debris as well. So just go ahead and sand that down once you're done cleaning the inside. Okay, that looks pretty good. Let's do this outer portion. Perfect. Now let's apply some copper never sees. That looks good. Now it's going to be time to inspect and clean the threads of your mounting bolts for the wheel bearing. Once you get the threading area cleaned up, go ahead and apply some red thread locker. Before we can put on that wheel bearing, let's go ahead and clean down our backing plate. Generally for this, you can just wipe it down, but of course you do want to give it a quick inspection and just make sure it doesn't look like it has any buildup on either side. Now it's going to be time to put our wheel bearing on. Of course, we're going to want to make sure that we put it through that backing plate, and then we'll just go ahead and slide it right on through here. Essentially, the way that you want to have this wheel bearing set up is so that the backing is facing straight up and down. You can of course have it side to side, but then your mounting holes aren't going to line up. Now once you have it all on there, let's go ahead and start putting in each of our mounting bolts. Once they're all started, we can snug them up and torque them to manufacturer specification. And of course, you're going to want to make sure that you have the backing area where that ABS sensor is facing in the proper direction. All right, now we can go ahead and bottom out each of our bolts. When we do this, I always go kind of crisscross, making an X. There we go. Now the bearing's completely drawn into the backing. Just double check this one real quick. All right, now we can torque each of these to 52 foot-pounds. Now I'm going to be doing rear brakes on this at the same time, but if you were going to be reusing your original rotors, of course you're going to want to make sure that you clean up the backing area that goes right up against that wheel bearing that you just put in. Go ahead and sand it down. Let's apply a little bit of copper never sees to the bearing mating surface. Let's go ahead and put our rotor onto the bearing. Once I have it on there, typically I like to use one of my lug nuts. I'll just put it on and bottom it out. That's essentially going to hold the rotor for us so it doesn't wobble around while we continue. Now let's go ahead and carefully get back here. We're going to squeeze in our wire, listen for a click, give it a little tug to make sure that's completely secure. Now this is looking really good. Let's continue on by pushing in this caliper piston. Typically on calipers, you can use some sort of clamp and just go ahead and try to press this right in, and the piston should go into its resting position. On this particular caliper, what you're going to see looking at the piston is that you have two little dimples on it. Now for those dimples, you're going to need a special tool that looks like this, that essentially fits into those dimples, and that way there we can go ahead and twist this piston as we try pressing it in at the same time. If you don't have this tool, you could also try using some long nose pliers. Typically that's a little bit harder. Okay. Now when I finish, what I want to do is have these dimples essentially facing straight up and down. So if this hole right here was right there, what I want to do is just turn this a little bit more, so essentially it's just straight. That looks pretty good. Let's set this aside. All right, so now we can take our caliper bracket bolts and that caliper bracket. We'll go ahead and get the bracket in position, sliding it over the rotor. Start in both of those caliper bracket bolts, snug them up. All right. So now that I have them both bottomed out, let's torque each of these to 91 foot-pounds. Now it's going to be time to install our brake pads. You want to pay attention to the wear indicator on each of the pads. For that, you want to have it facing so that as this rotor is going to be turning, this is going to be getting pulled away from in towards the brakes. Just in case it ends up getting to the wear indicator, it's not going to go ahead and toss it into the brakes while you're driving. Slide that right into position. Now what you want to do once you get them in there is just make sure that they can still flow around easily. If you have to use a hammer to try to bonk them in, more than likely something isn't cleaned properly. Slide that right on. Now we're going to carefully bring this down and over. Should slide right over those pads. Make sure you push that slider out of the way. Now we can get that caliper slider bolt in. Wiggle it around. Go ahead and bottom this out, and when you torque this, torque it to 20 foot-pounds. Now let's make our way in here. We're going to re-secure our emergency brake bracket to this control arm. For this, you don't need to use any red thread locker, but I would use a little bit of copper never seize. Now once you have that on there, of course you're going to want to re-secure your ABS wire to the e-brake cable. Make sure that's on there. Alright, let's go ahead and get this lug nut off of here. Now we can go ahead and put on our wheel. We'll start on all the lug nuts and bottom them out. Once the wheel is safely back on the ground, go ahead and torque each of these to 100 foot-pounds in a crisscross manner. Torqued. Of course, we're going to put back on our plastic covers. Make sure those are all bottomed out and snug. Okay friends, we got our wheel bearing in there. What's left to do now? Now of course you're going to want to make sure that you get inside the passenger compartment and pump up that brake so it's nice and firm. After that, go ahead and start it up, make sure you don't have an ABS light, and then take it for a road test. Thanks for watching.